recently, there seems to be, at least on surface, that there's a possible détente forming between United States and Russia over Ukraine, and with China over the geopolitical competition over East Asia. And there's even a RAND report about deprioritizing. There was a Pentagon leak about deprioritizing competition with China and focus on what they call quote unquote homeland, and what by which they really mean West Hemisphere, which include Latin America. But there's more recent development, because apparently the RAND report has been retracted. People find out it was gone. So what do you think all this means? Like, first of all, do you think there's a détente, a pending détente happening? And the second of all, we can pivot to talk about Latin America, why that Trump administration is choosing at this particular juncture to crank up the aggression toward Venezuela up to 11.
Yeah, well, those questions are directly related, so it makes sense. To answer your question briefly, I do not think there's a détente. I would say there's a change in strategy. And of course, every US president is a war criminal, is an imperialist, but they sometimes had different strategies. And if you look in Trump's first term, he continued the new Cold War against China that really started under Obama. A lot of people claim it started under Trump in his first term. It was Obama and the so-called pivot to Asia when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State. And originally, the US tried to have what they called a Russia reset. Hillary Clinton met with Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. She brought a red button with a mistranslated Russian phrase. And they said they wanted a reset because they wanted to prioritize containment of China. They could see that China was growing extremely fast with double-digit GDP growth, moving up the value chain, becoming a technological power, and they wanted to prevent China from overtaking the US. And that failed for a variety of reasons, especially because the situation with Russia only got worse with the US-backed coup in Ukraine in 2014, and then the annexation of Crimea, which historically had been part of Russia, and then the war in Ukraine that the US set off in the eastern part of Ukraine, escalating sanctions on Russia. All of that only made it more difficult for the US to try to bring about this Kissingerian triangulation strategy of breaking apart Russia and China. It pushed Russia and China closer together. And then with the new phase of the Ukraine war in 2022, we now see that there's no way within our lifetimes for decades, there's no way that the US is going to be able to ally with Russia against China. Russia and China now are very close partners. So that strategy starting under Obama and continuing in the first Trump administration, going into Biden, that clearly failed. But what's interesting is when Trump came in his first term, he obviously did try to improve relations with Russia, which explains this nonsense Russiagate, operation, which, you and I were always very skeptical about. It was obviously always nonsense. But ironically, this Russiagate paranoia also prevented the US from improving relations with Russia, which ended up being good for China. And then when Biden came in, some very naive people thought that Biden would be softer on China because Trump had started the trade war in China in his first term. And again, he kind of accelerated the new Cold War in China that started under Obama. But actually, when Biden came in, he was also very hawkish against China in a slightly different way. So for instance, Trump applied more blanket tariffs on China, whereas Biden's trade war on China was much more targeted. It was more of a tech war, targeting the high-tech sectors in China, what they called the three new things, the Xinjiang, the three most important industries that are now, that China is the world leader in, which are solar panels, electric vehicles, and batteries, especially lithium-ion batteries and other batteries. Those were the sectors targeted by the Biden White House with tariffs of 50 to 100%. So today it's almost impossible to get a Chinese EV in the US, even though they make the best EVs in the world. And there are more than 100 Chinese companies making EVs, including some state-owned companies like Chang'an. But of course, BYD has become the juggernaut. It's now the world's #1 producer and exporter of EVs, and they're much cheaper, as in much lower cost than Teslas, and they're better quality. I've been in many Chinese EVs here because anytime you take a Didi, like a taxi, they're almost all EVs at this point, especially in the tier 1 cities like Beijing and Shanghai. So Chinese EVs are amazing, and they're being exported to countries around the world, not the US. The US does have Tesla, by the way. Slightly over half, a slight majority of all Teslas are made in China, especially in the Shanghai mega factory. But anyway, and we now see European companies are saying that they want to make their EVs in China because it's the only way to make them competitive. But anyway, getting back to this to answer your question about this narrative of the new Cold War in China and how it's evolved. So Biden continued this war, but in a different way. It was more targeted at the high-end sector in China. And Biden's Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, said that the U.S. strategy was to prevent China from innovating, to prevent China from catching up technologically, which, also J.D. Vance made a similar comment recently. J.D. Vance is, of course, the U.S. vice president under Trump in his second term. Vance gave a speech at this venture capital conference in Washington, D.C., backed by Andreessen Horowitz. These are billionaire venture capitalists in Silicon Valley who are very pro-Trump. And he complained that when the U.S. allowed China into the U.S.-dominated international financial system and allowed China to join the World Trade Organization, the WTO, in 2001, it was under the impression that China would always be subservient, that China would provide cheap labor to manufacture goods that were designed by U.S. corporations. He mentioned, for instance, the iPhone. He said very clearly something that, critics critics of neoliberal globalization have been saying for a long time, and not just me, other people, that the point of neoliberal globalization was trapping China into this international division of labor, so U.S. corporations would provide the most high value added services that are the most profitable, like designing the iPhone, designing chips and things like that. And they would be physically manufactured by Chinese workers. They didn't want Chinese companies to also design chips and also design computers and electric vehicles and all these things. So it would keep Chinese people trapped permanently much lower in the totem pole, subservient to the US. And of course, China did not want that. The Chinese government prioritized its industrial policy, moving up the value chain, creating its own technological giants, which are all now being sanctioned and tariffed by the US. So this brings us to Trump 2. In fact, I was just reading this morning, Reuters reported that the Pentagon is now pushing to add several other major Chinese tech giants to the entity list, which would be a form of sanctions on Chinese companies. They already did this to Huawei to try to destroy Huawei. They, they forced Canada to kidnap Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei and the daughter of the founder of Huawei, which was a major act of aggression against China, targeting its most important tech company. And people in the West may know, Huawei makes phones and computers, but they make everything. I mean, Huawei is this massive company that is in every major high-end tech industry, including electric vehicles, by the way, they've been trying to do, but also semiconductors. Huawei is challenging NVIDIA, trying to design very high value-added chips and to break that monopoly that NVIDIA has. Anyway, now after going after Huawei, the Pentagon under Trump, Pete Hegseth, the more accurately named Department of War, is pushing to put Alibaba and BYD and Baidu on the list, the entity list. I mean, these are like the biggest Chinese tech companies. So this all fits into this argument that I do not think we're seeing a détente. I think we're seeing a shift in strategy, and we're still going to see more sanctions, more tariffs. I think in the very short term, maybe for a year, the U.S. has decided that it can't continue with more tariffs on China because China was able to defend itself, unlike any other country. Trump in April, on his so-called Liberation Day, he announced these sky-high tariffs on countries around the world, and basically no country was able to defend itself. China was the only country that had the capacity to do so. The US hit China with tariffs. China hit back with proportional tariffs. And at a few points, the tariffs on China, the US tariffs, were over 140%, which is absurd. That's just a trade embargo. And then China, in response to the US levying more export restrictions on China, especially of high end chips, China responded with the restriction of the export of rare earth metals and magnets, which are extremely important for the industrial supply chain for high-tech products in the US, and especially for the military-industrial complex. So rare earths are needed in cars and computers and things like that, but they're also needed in weapon systems and missiles. So the US military-industrial complex, which is making all these weapons to prepare for a potential future war with China, needs rare earths produced by China. China restricted the export of those rare earths, and China dominates the global supply chain. So these factors forced the US to take a step back. And essentially, Trump, with this agreement that he made with President Xi Jinping in South Korea in October, they took a step back to where the situation was when Trump came into office. The tariff level on China is still pretty high, but it's where it was when Trump entered. So overall, I mean, I think the strategy that the US government has recognized that they cannot actually escalate in the short term because it will cause too much damage to the US, especially economically, in the short term. So they need to prepare for the medium to the long term to have a strategy of decoupling. This is this term that in Washington they constantly use, they're obsessed with. And I think that is what they're trying to do, genuinely, is to decouple economically from China. If you look at China's exports to the US, 20 years ago, they were extremely high. And in general, China's exports as a share of GDP was higher than the global average 20 years ago. Today, it's actually lower than the global average, which, if you read the Western financial press, you might be surprised to hear that. China does still depend on exporting a lot of technological goods, but you look at pretty much every other industry, and the vast majority of Chinese products are purchased and consumed domestically because it has a big market, a massive market of 1.4 billion people. But China does still rely on exporting some tech products, and the US market has become less and less important. 5 years ago, it was nearly 15% of China's exports. Now it's probably around 11% as of this year, and dropping more and more. China's largest trading partner now is actually not the US or even Europe. It's actually ASEAN, the Southeast Asian countries. So what we're seeing is gradually China and the US move toward this decoupling. You can never have full decoupling, but instead it'll be their trade and their supply chains will be rerouted through other countries. So the US is trying to friend shore and near shore the supply chain. So instead of making iPhones in China, they're trying to make iPhones unsuccessfully in India and move a lot of that production into Vietnam, where they're having much more success. Because Vietnam, basically has the same system as China. They're very similar. China's system is a socialist market economy, as it's called. Vietnam's system is called a socialist-oriented market economy. They're both run by Communist Party. Very similar system. And Vietnam has kind of borrowed from a lot of China's experience in the reform and opening up to use industrial policy, state-led in planning and investment to move up the global supply chain and make more manufacturing at the higher end of the supply chain. So, I mean, we're going to see this stuff happen over time. But what really happened is that the US economically realized that it's actually more dependent on China than vice versa. So the more the US escalates, it actually causes more damage to the US. So in this kind of game theory scenario, the US has to take a step back and be a little more cautious and move a little bit more toward short-term de-escalation in order to prepare for medium-term escalation again. And then the military element is part of this as well. If you look at any Pentagon war games exercise, and they've done many with China, they found that they lose in almost every scenario, or even in the so-called best case scenario, as reported by Politico, both sides lose. China and the US are devastated in any kind of war. So, I mean, these people in the Pentagon, these war planners, they see the situation and they say, well, it's not realistic for us. First of all, both sides have nuclear weapons. Even if they could have some kind of direct conflict, which seems less and less likely given that situation with nuclear weapons. It seems more likely there would be some kind of proxy war where the US uses the Philippines and Japan to try to wage a proxy war against China, maybe in the South China Sea, or who knows. Even that is looking more and more untenable, more difficult. So I think what in the Pentagon they've come to accept is that they have to go back to a kind of Cold War strategy where it's not detente, but instead of escalating too much that could risk a conventional war that would bring about extreme destruction and potentially nuclear war, they have to find a way to use third parties to escalate. And it's going to look, I mean, it's looking more and more like the first Cold War. I'm not saying it's exactly the same as the first Cold War, but in the first Cold War, starting roughly around 1945 until 1991, detente wasn't until the 1980s. And then by that time, the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapsing, right? China is nowhere looking, it's not in any situation even remotely close. In fact, the US is much more unstable than the Chinese government right now. So I wouldn't compare it to detente. I would say it's kind of the early stages of the Cold War where they've recognized that a hot war is not feasible. So they want to figure out how to continue to put pressure on China, but to do so without increasing the backlash against the US.
Now, before we move to the next topic on US pivot to Latin America, I kind of want to dig in this topic a little more. What is the logic of decoupling? Why would US push for decoupling from China when, for a while, it looks like US multinationals were also profiting from trading with China? I mean, that's why they move a lot of the production to China in the first place. So why now to try to reverse that process and try to decouple from the Chinese supply chain?
Yeah, well, it depends which multinational corporations, right? Because there were some that relied especially on Chinese labor that were manufacturing intensive. But now a lot of these companies want protectionism. They don't want to compete with China because they can compete with China, especially the tech companies, right? This is why they're trying to ban TikTok. It's why they're trying to ban BYD. In fact, Elon Musk, if you look at most of the big billionaires in the US, Elon Musk is one of the very few who's actually involved in manufacturing. The vast majority of these tech billionaires, they don't actually make products. They make software or they make AI models or whatever. There are a few that make the actual technological goods. They're terrified of competition from China. So Elon Musk, for instance, even when Biden was president, he went on an earnings call with Tesla shareholders, and he said very clearly that if there are no tariffs and protectionist measures levied against BYD will destroy Tesla. And like 2 months after he said that, the Biden White House put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. So, I mean, this is obvious. I mentioned this speech that JD Vance gave where he complains about, iPhones. I mean, look at how is Apple going to, first of all, move its production out of China? It's very difficult. It's trying to move it to India. It's very difficult to do. But even if it can succeed in doing that, I mean, the only way that that Apple will continue to be able to continue competing with Huawei and Honor and Xiaomi and there are literally dozens of Chinese phone companies that make very good, much cheaper phones. And you're in Southeast Asia. I'm sure everyone there is using Honor, Xiaomi, like it's all Chinese phones. Yeah. But like even average people, like Redmi is like the Xiaomi cheaper version and stuff. Like there's no way that like there will be a few like hipsters who insist on buying an iPhone even though it's 3 times more expensive. But like the only way these US and European companies will be able to compete is through protectionist measures, is through very heavy tariffs. And which ironically is what the US always accused China of. China did have high tariffs in the 70s and 80s and the early 90s as it was, in the beginning their reform and opening up, but it had to remove most of those tariffs by the time it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. But anyway, the point is that those companies are deathly afraid of Chinese competition. But there were certainly other companies that when China didn't have competitors, they loved investing in China because they could simply exploit lower paid Chinese workers who were very skilled, very well educated, thanks to all of the, the policies. I mean, people love to talk about the reform and opening up, which of course was very important in China's development. But even going back to the Mao era, people like to erase all of that. But that's why the Chinese population was very well educated, was well clothed and fed, and had basic infrastructure. And then the reform and opening up built upon that. India never had that kind of revolutionary experience. There's still hundreds of millions of people in India who are illiterate, who don't have enough food, who don't have access to water and electricity. All of that basic infrastructure and human capital development was already, that base was set in the Mao era. So when Deng Xiaoping initiated the reform and opening up in 78, they had all of the necessary infrastructure and education levels and all of that in order to have this very skilled, educated workforce. And at first, yes, they were working for these foreign companies, but China knew they didn't want to just stay at this lower level in the supply chain. They wanted to make their own tech companies and their own firms that could actually challenge these Western monopolies. So I think, there's this idea that from 20 years ago that all these US multinationals loved investing in China. Well, I think the situation today is quite different. I haven't even talked about, the financial sector in the US, which also, they're very, these days, I mean, there have been like ebbs and flows, but these days they're very bearish on the Chinese financial sector. They are very skeptical about the Chinese financial sector because China's financial sector is state-owned. It has capital controls. So now getting back to this idea of decoupling that you asked about. Decoupling, I think, why does the US want to do this? Well, obviously, because if you're preparing for more and more conflict, even if it's not a direct conventional war, if you're going to have more conflict, the US is going to impose only more and more sanctions in the future. I mean, come on, like this idea that there will be fewer sanctions is absurd. And in order to prepare for that situation and to minimize the backlash, the blowback on the US economically, they have to decouple more and more. This is the issue with the whole rare earth issue, right? Because the US now recognizes that it can't escalate as much as it would like to because it would actually cause more damage to the US than it would cause to China, right? So if the US can decouple, and this is why the US Congress, the House Committee on China, this crazy anti-China committee that Marco Rubio was a key part of, they published a report detailing the US plan to develop a new supply chain for critical minerals to try to remove China from that supply chain and many other sectors. I mean, I mentioned, iPhones and all of these technological products that are still made in China. They're trying to move them to other countries so that 5-10 years from now, when they hit China with more sanctions, and eventually they're going to do to China what they've done to Russia. I mean, it's inevitable. They're going to do that. They're going to try to disconnect Chinese banks from the SWIFT system. This is why China is quietly but gradually developing its alternative to SWIFT, which is called CIPS, CIPS. And, China, one major difference between China and Russia is Russia loves to like boast about all of the ways it's resisting the West and standing up to the US and then kind of beat their chest, which is cool. I mean, I respect that. Like, we need that. China's the opposite. China always is, it's very humble, and it's the Deng Xiaoping strategy of maintain a low profile, bide your time, right? Lie low and bide your time. So China is doing a lot of this stuff, but it doesn't talk about it publicly. It's very quiet. But China is developing these financial alternatives. It's de-dollarizing its foreign exchange reserves. It's massively buying lots and lots of gold. A lot of this is not officially reported in the reports from the People's Bank of China, the Chinese central bank, but we've seen reports in like the Financial Times and Bloomberg that China is just stockpiling all of this gold and reducing its holdings of US Treasury securities, preparing for more sanctions. I mean, the decoupling is necessary for the further escalation. This is why, again, I don't see any evidence of détente. I see evidence of a de-escalation in the short term to prepare for more medium to long-term escalation to minimize the blowback on the US.
And you mentioned tech companies and Jason, and that actually reminds me, a lot of the very hardcore China hawks in US are these Silicon Valley tech bros like Palantir. Palantir co-founder Alex Karp is one of the hardcore China hawks, but really a lot of their rhetorics strike me as they're just trying to expand their grip, because their whole line is, you have to give us $500 billion of investment because we cannot let China win. That's why, you must give $500 billion to the Stargate project, or you have to give us $1 trillion to build data centers because China cannot win. I mean, that's like literally their only selling point is you have to blow up this AI bubble because we cannot have China develop Terminator and Skynet first. We got to be the first to do that. So yeah, I think there's definitely that at play. Now, what?
One quick note, Carl. So OpenAI, this is the most influential US AI company. It's a private company, but it's largely owned by Microsoft. Microsoft has a very big stake in it. And OpenAI's CEO, of course, OpenAI makes ChatGPT. OpenAI's CEO, Sam Altman, this, billionaire tech bro from Silicon Valley, he has been lobbying hard to ban DeepSeek and now Kimi and all of the other Chinese AI models. First of all, they're open source, which is terrifying these US AI companies because their whole business model is operating at a loss for several years and then establishing a monopoly and then charging very high monopoly rents, massively increasing the prices. This is the Uber business model, right? Uber was losing money for most of its history. It destroyed most of its competitors, got over 70% market share, and then massively increased prices of taxis. This is what OpenAI wanted to do. And obviously, China's open source models prevent so-called OpenAI from having that. It should be called closed AI. And then furthermore, I don't know if you saw that OpenAI published a letter recently, an open letter to a US government institution in Washington that oversees like technology policy and investment. And they begged the US government for more investment from the Pentagon in particular. And the entire letter is framed about, we have to stop China. And this is why the government, one, should back OpenAI's loans. In case they can't pay their loans, the government should pay them. And two, they should invest in the energy grid and data centers on behalf of OpenAI because China. And they talk about the so-called electron gap with China, which is reminiscent in the first Cold War of the missile gap with the Soviet Union. They now say we have an electron gap with China because China's electricity capacity is now almost double that of the US and massively growing. So all of these, not all of them, but many of these tech companies are framing the reason that they're using the new Cold War as an opportunity to ask the US government to protect them and to ban their Chinese competitors. OpenAI literally called for banning Chinese AI models, claiming that they're government backed and they're going to be used to spy on people, like the TikTok rhetoric, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of projection when in the U.S. discourse about China.